Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Chaucer's Books virtual author talk with Carol Hay, who wrote Think Like a Feminist, The Philosophy Behind the Revolution, published by W.W. Norton, and Kate Manne, who wrote entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women from Random House Crown. My name is Michael Takeuchi, and I'm the events coordinator at Chaucer's Bookstore, an independent bookstore based in Santa Barbara, California, that was founded in 1974 by our current owner, Mari Curley. To purchase tonight's and other books, to check out our upcoming events, or to learn more about our store, please visit our website, chaucersbooks.com. While our authors, our moderator, and myself will be the only ones visible and heard on this webinar, we do have an active Q&A function on the screen we will utilize. Time permitting, we'll be able to answer those questions. So please feel free to type in questions regarding this author discussion. Tonight's approximately 1 hour webinar will be recorded and will be available to view shortly after programs end. So let's begin. To introduce our speakers and to moderate tonight's event, I am pleased to introduce Julinna Oxley. Dr. Oxley is a professor of philosophy and religion, as well as the director of women's and gender studies at Coastal Carolina University. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I should also say I was recently replaced as Women's and Gender Studies Director, but I am the former director of that program. So I just don't want to take any credit away from the person now doing the job. So thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm grateful to Carol and Kate for being with us tonight to talk about their recent publications. We've gotten a little introduction of them, so I'll just do a brief introduction of Carol Hay. She is a professor of philosophy at UMass Lowell, which is just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and it's been there for what, 5 to 10 years, somewhere around there?
12, I think, yeah.
12. These days, the years just slip by. And we're also excited to have Professor Kate Manne. She's an associate professor of philosophy at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and was recently tenured in the last year or two and is making an absolutely wonderfully big splash in the feminist philosophy scene. So both of these scholars are scholars of feminist philosophy and are doing really amazing work. And so I'm really excited to talk to them tonight about their 2 recent publications. So they held up their books. I get to hold up 2 books. So the way I'd like to proceed tonight is I've got some questions that I'd like to start with. And I'm going to sort of rotate back and forth between our 2 authors tonight. And then I'd like to hopefully talk for maybe 30 minutes with them. And I'll be moderating the questions. So if at any point you have some questions, I do plan to leave time at the end for questions from the audience, although if they seem pertinent to something that we're talking about at the moment, I will be sure to integrate, or I will attempt to integrate that question into our discussion at the moment. Okay, so to begin our discussion tonight, I'd like to ask each author to give just a quick summary of what their argument is and what their main points are in each of their respective books. So let's see, Carol, would you like to begin? Would you tell us about what's in Think Like a Feminist?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Julinna. So Think Like a Feminist is basically a book that I wrote because I was tired of what felt to me like a lot of misconceptions out there in the world about what feminism actually amounts to. Having been a feminist my whole life and having basically been teaching feminism for a couple of decades at this point, I hit this point where I came to sort of realize that there were a lot of really common misconceptions, a lot of blind spots, a lot of caricatures of feminism that were really sort of, in my view, sort of holding people back from really understanding what was going on with feminism. And so I thought, you know what, I have tenure, I can write for the public now. I want to write a book for regular people. This isn't for academics, this is just for ordinary people. My goal was to write something that was really accessible, really funny. I fought tooth and nail with Amy Cherry, my wonderful editor at Norton, so she would let me swear just a little bit, right? Because I feel like I can't communicate this stuff unless I can swear just a little bit. So the thought is that, I mean, the topic itself is serious, but the presentation is in some ways lighthearted, and it's meant to be accessible, right? I mean, I envision people reading this on the beach. I envision people reading this in book clubs and, you know, giving it to their family members for holidays and things like that. So it's meant to be an easy read on a subject that I think is sort of inherently interesting, and something that I think in the wake of the Me Too movement and other sort of recent events, I think there's sort of a resurgent interest in feminism. And so I was really happy to be able to have the opportunity to write the book for everyone about what feminism is, and the ideas behind the activism.
Okay, great. All right, thanks. Kate, what about you? Tell us about Entitled.
Yeah, sure. And thanks so much to Carol for having the conversation with me, and for Julinna for hosting and having this dialogue, as well as the bookstore Chaucer's for having us at this Zoom event. So Entitled is similar in terms of intended audience. It's very much a trade book intended for a general audience rather than an academic one. My first book, Down Girl, was a crossover book intended for both an academic and a trade audience. And this is a book, Entitled is a book that I hope philosophers will get something out of, but it's not squarely pitched to philosophers. And the basic premise of the book is that various facets of male entitlement are deeply intertwined and give rise to misogyny when women don't honor supposed male entitlements, when they don't give men what they're supposedly obligated to give men. And these, I can give you just a quick rundown of some of the areas that the book pertains to. So perhaps most obviously there's sexual entitlement, but I think there's still more insidious forms of entitlement to, for one thing, admiration, which I argue underlies the phenomenon of incels. So people who, these are young men, invariably heterosexual, who regard themselves as entitled not just to sex from women, but to sexual admiration from them. Also to sexual consent, which gives the lie to the idea that consent is sufficient as opposed to necessary for ethical sex. Because if in a patriarchal society there's a sense that men are entitled to sexual consent, then it follows that some consensual sex can still be quite problematic, if not necessarily blameworthy. And I also talk about a sense of entitlement to caregiving, to nurture, to domestic labor, to reproductive labor, to material support from women. And in the last few sections of the book, I talk about a sense of male entitlement to power and claims to knowledge. And by the same token, I also think there's often women are denied what they're actually entitled to in a patriarchal society, things like medical care, and the domestic support that women actually deserve is something that women, especially women of color, are often systematically denied. So that's the basic shape of the book.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. I think those are great summaries. I'd like to talk about I don't mean to launch into the real heart of the matter, but why not?
No, please.
So one of the topics that both of you talk about in your books is the topic of the Me Too movement. And Kate, you've been talking about sexual entitlement and how, and sexual assault and all these problems. Just as a side note, I was surprised in reading your books about how little overlap there was. Like, you would think that there's two books by two feminist philosophers and they would be saying the same thing, and they're just not. So, but I was able to find one topic that you both did address, and that was Me Too. And both of you talk about the movement, but you seem to have sort of different views on the movement's, achievements to this point. And Carol, you begin your book by talking about how something has changed and that the accretion of male sins has become impossible to ignore, and that we have really just thrown open the gates now to recognizing and addressing sexual assault. And I kind of agreed with that. I think that was right. But then, Kate, when I was reading your book, you said that it would be tempting to conclude that the ground has shifted with respect to the Me Too movement, and that we are at last taking sexual assault seriously. And you seem to imply that it's maybe still a problem and it's just not being taken seriously. So I'd like to hear from both of you. We sort of have these two slightly different opinions on what the Me Too movement, its goal is, maybe what its accomplishments are, whether it's made true strides, and how that's changed the national scene. And I'm just wondering if I would like to hear both of you comment on what you think about the Me Too movement. So as I started with Carol the last time. Kate, I'll go ahead and begin with you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So I certainly am unreservedly in favor of the Me Too movement, and I don't want to understate its achievements thus far. I do think that, and I think that's something Carol will probably expand on, so I won't spend too much time on that. But I do think I wanted to point in my book to a few key limitations of the movement, and perhaps a perception that it was somehow complete that I wanted to question. And in particular, in that passage, the thing that concerned me was a tendency to go after some people deservedly, in particular older male predators who had sort of passed their point of commercial capitalist viability, who were no longer going to make very much money for anyone. People like Harvey Weinstein to some extent in his 60s, but also, more noticeably, Bill Cosby, Roger Ailes, these are people in their 70s and 80s who are really past it by the lights of capitalist ageist logic. And I saw a real reluctance to hold younger perpetrators accountable. So in my book, I give examples where people like Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey, some of the most notorious Me Too perpetrators, we know that they began offending in middle age, or even younger than middle age, so their 30s, or I think Spacey even in his 20s. We also know that the average sexual assailant begins perpetrating in adolescence. So according to self-report measures, the average perpetrator begins at 16. And that's probably somewhat of an overestimate. It's probably a little younger than that even. We also know between a quarter and a third of sexual assault in the US is committed by juvenile offenders. And so I guess a worry that I have about the Me Too movement is that we're not yet going after the golden boys. We're not yet holding younger perpetrators accountable. We're really thinking of this in broader terms than the kind of dirty old man stereotype that is problematic in itself, but also allows us to kind of culturally dispose of people who had reached their expiration date. So I think we have to be a bit more sweeping about which men we hold accountable. Thanks.
Okay, that's useful. Thank you. Carol?
Yeah, Kate, I think that's fascinating. And I don't think we disagree here. I think if anything, we're just sort of focusing on different aspects of it. So when I wrote those, that take on the Me Too movement, I mean, the process of writing a book takes a while, right? So this was pre-pandemic. This was, back when we were all still out in the world. And it really, I mean, I really do think that there were times, especially early in the movement, where it really felt like something had changed, right? There was the momentum from the Women's March. There was, it really felt like conversations that I'd been having behind closed doors with female friends, for most of my adult life, were suddenly things that were acceptable to talk about in public, right? And a lot of the sort of airing of dirty laundry that for the longest time was only really the kind of thing that happened sort of in the corners or behind closed doors. I mean, we would see, even in the discipline of philosophy, we would sometimes see a public reckoning of a character that was deemed to be especially egregious, right? But for the most part, these things were not, it was not talked about, but it was one of those sort of open secrets. Like women would talk about it amongst themselves, right? And so we saw, but then suddenly it was something that you could talk about in public, right? So there was that famous Excel spreadsheet that many women working in the film industry had, where they were just like naming names. And there was this moment, I think, early in the Me Too movement, where it really felt like this, if not something new in sort of like as a matter of quantity, it was just a matter of quality in some way. Like there really was something new. And that energy, of course, comes and goes like any kind of social progress. I think it's often sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and there's always some backlash. I do write about the backlash in the book as well, right? How you saw really pretty quickly, right, the kind of predictable, you know, tutting about how all these poor innocent men are going to be, you know, presumed guilty and these sorts of things. And so I think with any kind of social progress, we do see this back and forth. I mean, I think I do worry in some ways that the pandemic has drained a bit of energy from the movement. It's also just, you know, like I think it's harder to perpetrate some of the kinds of crimes that the Me Too movement was so good at you know, calling out, because we're all stuck at home in our pajamas, right? So, but so yeah, the world has moved on, and I think that it's our analyses of the Me Too movement have to move with it. I think I also agree with Kate that the movement really needs to be very careful to continue to be careful to attend to the experiences of all women, especially women at the margins, and not as an afterthought, but rather to center those experiences. This is something that I read about in my book about how this is a mistake that the history of feminism tends to be pretty bad about. We tend to be really good at centering the experiences of cis, white, able-bodied, rich women, who already have quite a bit of social power, and thinking of basically all of other women, which is, to be clear, most women on the planet, right, as an afterthought. And this is a correction that I really sort of try to push in the book as something that feminism is getting better at, but we have to be so very careful to keep getting better at it. And I think the Me Too movement is an example of that as well.
Yeah, I really appreciated that aspect of the book, Carol, and it reminded me of the way the Me Too movement I talked about the perpetrator aspect, but also on the victim aspect, it kind of tended to center white, beautiful Hollywood actresses, kind of the perfect, quote unquote, perfect victims who we could actually sympathize with in as much as we ever seriously sympathize with female victims. And so, yeah, I think there's a danger of it leaving behind people who Tarana Burke originally wanted most to rightly call our attention to as a leader of the movement for over a decade, Black and brown girls who we overlook far, far too easily, among others who, just as Carol said, you know, in being women of color, in being trans, in being maybe an older woman who's often rendered invisible. You know, these are all women who, as you know, and I should talk too about the obvious class dimensions of this, you know, the way women who are richer are seen as victims who we can take seriously, while other women tend to fall by the wayside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, that's really, I think that's a useful analysis. And I'm really happy to hear you guys talk about this, because I know it's a very important part of feminism today, at least in you know, what's happening currently. We got a really great question from an audience member, and I feel like this would be a great follow-up, because so the question has to do with how to encourage and attract allies, especially men. And she's saying that she works in a place where she does different kinds of diversity trainings and wants men to feel intrigued and curious and welcome to participate. And when we start talking about Me Too, I have a feeling that most men just kind of like shut down and their sparks fly, and they're like, all of a sudden get super defensive, even though, you know, hopefully most men aren't, you know, sexual assaulters. And so I think that this is a great question, just given our current topic, like, how do we attract men to feminism? A lot, as soon as, I mean, I often call it the F word when I'm teaching. I'm sure that you do too. It is a word that many people just, they hear and the sirens go off and they shut down. So what can we do to address that? What can we do to overcome many of these prejudices, again, that Carol, that you talked about, these misconceptions at the beginning? And Carol, I'll just let you start to answer this question. So. Sure,
yeah. So in part, I think that this is a great question, because it really has put its finger on one of the major motivations I had for writing this book, right? Was the recognition that there are a lot of misconceptions about what feminism really amounts to. And these misconceptions sort of allow us to not take feminism seriously, right? So I start off the book talking about feminism's PR problem, right? And I like to joke that if I had a dollar for every time I heard someone say, I'm not a feminist, but, and then say a bunch of feminist things, like I could solve the wage gap single-handedly, right? So I think that the problem of attracting allies is in part the problem of getting beyond these misconceptions that people have. And that's one of the things I really try to do and Think Like a Feminist, to show how feminists really are in the business of pointing out these structural, systemic, institutional imbalances of power and privilege that systematically benefit men at women's expense. And it's much less to do with blaming your finger or pointing your finger at individual men or blaming individual men. Like the analyses that we're after really are these sort of structural analyses. And I guess maybe I'll ask you, Kate, so we had talked maybe about possibly reading a section, short excerpts from our books. And actually I'd flagged the section that I wanted to read today. And it actually speaks just to this. So if you wouldn't mind if I could just read my little section now, is that okay?
Please. Great.
Sorry, audience, I'm giving this to you now. So this comes at the end of my book in the last chapter, where I'm trying to give practical advice for for things people can actually do to address some of the concerns that I've spent the book outlining. And I'm talking specifically actually in this section about the idea that men in general are not the enemy, right? So it's not, feminism is no matter of man hating or things like that, right? So that's the context that this comes into. Okay, put some glasses on because I'm old. All right, so the thought here is that we need to know our enemy. So as I hope I've shown, men in general are not the enemy. They too are shaped in a patriarchal system that creates their assumptions about men and women. Men can be co-opted by a culture that plays on their insecurities or promises to entrench the tacit benefits they glean from a sexist culture. They can be lured into thinking they're superior to women in an attempt to make up for the stings of racism and classism. They can fail to be properly critical of our culture's narratives about what they're entitled to, something Kate talks a lot about. But men in general are as much at the mercy of patriarchy's whims as any woman. Feminism's real enemies are those men and women who will willingly support a patriarchal society and its social institutions, norms, assumptions, and expectations, many of which function below the level of which we're usually consciously aware. Sexism is effective and ubiquitous and pernicious enough that it might sometimes feel like a conspiracy hatched by a bunch of old white dudes in an oak-paneled boardroom somewhere. But I assure you that no feminists think sexism works this way. It'd be easier, honestly, if we could just identify a few or a whole cart of bad sexist apples and haul them off to re-education camps or whatever. But because sexism probably goes back to the beginnings of human civilization and often functions below the level of conscious awareness, getting rid of the patriarchy is going to require more than culling the herd. We need to strategize for the long game. So some of the concrete things that you can do, I discussed in previous chapters. Quit with the gender reveal parties and start asking why we're so obsessively focused on babies' genitals. Remember that women are diverse. Women are brown, black, white, cis, trans, queer, straight, rich, poor, differently abled. Stop thinking that a feminism crafted by corporations hawking fantasies of female empowerment through body wash is going to do anything to overturn the sexist status quo. Don't judge other women for how they bargain with the patriarchy and start admitting that we're all fallible and just trying to get by. In a world that's as unjust as ours, it's inevitable that some actions will entrench sexism. Don't write off a woman as irrational because she's angry or strident, especially if she's a woman of color. Consider the possibility that she's tracking reality, that her anger is precisely the right response. The time to merely lean in is over. We're done playing nice. After decades of backsliding and backlash, we're seeing glimmers of progress on some fronts with the Me Too movement, whose astonishing momentum has opened up new possibilities for political action, rooted in the recognition of shared experiences, shared frustrations, and shared ultimatums. Women are starting to band together again, and we're showing ourselves a force to be reckoned with. So thanks for letting me read that. And yeah, I do think that, again, the thought is that I want this to be a book for men as well as women, for allies, really to sort of, for people to understand that these aren't just problems that women face, and they aren't problems that are going to be solved by women alone.
Great, thanks, Carol. Kate, what do you think about this?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. I love that excerpt. I love that part of the book, the whole thing. But yeah, I think I have, I mean, my book is kind of less geared towards this question. So I think probably what I have to say is less helpful, but here it is. I think lots of misconceptions can be dispelled to kind of encourage people to come into the fold. And I think that that is very much something that feminist writing as well as activism can help with. I think it's good though to recognize that there are sources of hostility to feminism that are pretty closely associated with being a woman calling attention to moral problems, which is what feminists do. You know, pretty, at least paradigmatically, maybe even by definition. So one of the rules of patriarchy is that as a woman, you're supposed to devote all your moral attention to basically more privileged men and children. And that can take a variety of forms. It will depend on whether you're a white woman, a brown woman, a black woman. It can take the form for a black woman of being expected to adhere to what Patricia Hill Collins calls the mammy stereotype. For a white woman, it might be being expected to have biological children to supply the white supremacist hetero patriarchy with foot soldiers. You know, it really does take a variety of forms. But the point is that you're supposed to be a kind of giver of human goods like moral attention, concern, sympathy. And when you try to redirect some of that moral concern, sympathy, attention to issues that, of course, affect not, they don't exclusively affect women, but they predominantly affect women. And the reason why feminists call attention to them is because of a concern with women as well as girls, I take it, as well as hopefully non-binary persons. And when you do that, you'll get resistance because you're breaking a patriarchal norm, which says, redirect your attention where it's actually wanted and needed, which is to the proper subjects of your attention as a woman, that is men and children. So there is always going to be a lot of resistance, even setting aside bad information, which is absolutely out there, even setting aside a campaign to make us forget the possibility of solidarity. That's, again, absolutely out there. But even setting all that aside, there's still going to be resistance. And that doesn't mean, I would say to the person who asked this good question, doesn't mean you failed. It just means you're trying to do something important and hard, which is make a feminist point.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, Kate. And I think that you've made a wonderful point, which is that to some extent, feminism will always be, well, maybe not always, but at least in our lifetimes, will be an uphill battle. And it's not always something that's welcomed. You have to look for a receptive audience, look for moments where you have an opportunity to really make a point. We did get another question, but I kind of wanted, I think it's a wonderful question and comment, which I'll tell you in a minute, but it's a little bit related to something we'll talk about in about 10 minutes. So if the person who posed the question would kindly hold off, that would be great, or be patient rather.
Actually, just before we go on, I have to say, I don't think I swore in this book, but in my first book, even though it was an academic monograph designed to get me tenure, I did slip a fuck 'em past my editor against his will about this idea that, because there were no other words that would do at that point in the book, at the conclusion of the book, which was, it was to say fuck 'em to people who both require and who think that we should offer a kind of mild honey to attract, yeah. So, you know, the old saying that better to attract flies with honey rather than vinegar. You know, I think to some extent it's good to debunk that conception that just being milder and nicer and sweeter will get you what you want as a feminist. I think oftentimes it's not that you're somehow being acerbic, it's just that there is an inherently, there's something inherently subversive about just saying, pay attention to these people who matter just as much as men, namely women.
And that ties in, sorry, Julinna, if I'm jumping off or cutting you off, but this ties exactly into the two stereotypes of feminism that I spend one of the early chapters in Think Like a Feminist talking about, right? because I think that these two stereotypes get so much cultural uptake precisely because they defang feminism of its radical potential, right? So when you hear the F word, people usually tend to think either the angry feminist, right? And again, we have a lot of cultural scripts that permit us to avoid taking an angry woman seriously, and this is exacerbated if it's an angry woman of color, right? And then if we don't think that a feminist is a sort of unpleasant, angry woman, we think she's like a girl power feminist, right? Where it's this like fun, sexy kind of feminism where it's not actually going to ruffle any feathers, and she leans in at work, and she's not the angry feminist who's going to upset the status quo in any way. And I want to point out that that's not feminism either, right? But it's no coincidence that those stereotypes tend to be the first thing to pop in people's minds, because both of them let us not actually take things seriously.
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite parts of your book, Carol, is the girl power feminist, which I teach my girls, but they're under the age of 10. So
it's a good. It can be a good thin edge of the wedge for children.
So one of the things I wanted to be sure to talk about, and both of you have already kind of mentioned this a little bit, is the way that women's experiences are not monolithic. And I think we're all aware that we're three, white, well-educated, women who are having this conversation, but all of us, I know, care a lot about the variety of women's experiences and all that entails, and the reality of challenge of doing feminism when you need the input of an entire great sisterhood to give you an understanding of your experiences. So can you talk a little bit about how patriarchy affects women differently, or talk about intersectionality or anything like that, and how that's relevant to your approach in your book? Let's see, who did I start with the last time? Now I can't remember.
I think it was me, so Carol should go.
Oh yeah, I thought it was you. Right. I'm happy to talk about this. In any case, I
sorry, right. And my state of sleep differ. I think you're right. Was it me?
So I think I started with Carol. I'll start with Kate.
Okay, good. Yes. So sorry, I have a young baby, and so I'm generally pretty sleep deprived.
I feel your pain.
So I think that, this raises a crucial point. And one of the things that I try to do in my book is really draw, as I think Carol does too, on the vital work of Black feminists who have, in terms of my project, of particular relevance is work that does a lot to show how unique the experiences faced by Black women are. So the intersection of racism and misogyny in the US context is known as misogynoir, a term coined by Moya Bailey, who is a Black queer feminist theorist. And what she encourages us to think about, and which I also think is really brought out by work by Patricia Hill Collins that I mentioned, are stereotypes and tropes that Black women are required to conform to and punished in a misogynoirish vein for not living up to, that white women are simply not subject to. Thinking of the tropes of the mammy on the one hand, the welfare queen on the other, the Jezebel as well. And those are just a few of the kind of what Patricia Hill Collins calls controlling images to which Black women are subject. It means that although I think it's true that there are various ways in which a majority, although not all women, are kind of forced into caregiving roles, that will look completely different for a Black woman positioned socially as a mammy, basically expected to show care and concern in some manner for white children. Historically, for white children, she was tasked with caring for better than her own children, was the white supremacist thought about who she owed her loyalties to. That's a kind of both burden and an oppressive reality that white women are largely free from. And I mean, I could go on and talk more about both more specific intersections within those particular groups, but also obviously this is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to different social positions and different ways of being a woman that will be subject to vastly different kinds of patriarchal norms and expectations that are also that also have intersections with class, race, being cis or trans, being disabled or non-disabled, being of a certain age. So basically, I think that misogyny is a system that functions to police and enforce patriarchal norms and expectations. But what those patriarchal norms and expectations are differs markedly depending on all of those social factors.
Thank you. That's really useful. Kate, Carol, how about you?
Yeah, Kate, I think you've hit on a lot of really important factors. And the way I approach it in concerns of intersectionality in Think Like a Feminist is to really kind of have them at the center of the history of this movement that I tell, right? Because one of the things I do in this book is really just kind of bring the reader up to speed, give a kind of potted history of this is how feminism got here, right? So I talk about the three waves of feminism, beginning with the drive for suffrage, basically, up through the last century up till now. And every step of the way, I am very, very, very careful to point out feminism's failures. And in some ways, it can be really depressing, but like the history of the feminist movement is just the history of rich white women getting this wrong again and again and again. And we just keep, and women of color, feminists of color just keep saying, like they keep reminding us and we keep getting it wrong. And I'm bound and determined to not get it wrong, which is not to say I don't get it wrong, but I'm trying really hard in this book to not get this wrong. And so I make sure to point out that, like, if you look at the history of suffrage, right, that includes a history of Susan B. Anthony saying, I will cut off this right arm of mine before I ever work for the ballot for the Negro and not the woman, right? Or Betty Friedan, right, in the 60s, right, scaring up a lavender menace to disassociate feminism from lesbian women, right, because she was worried that, because there was a stereotype of feminism, of feminists as being lesbians, that if they actually sort of welcomed lesbian women into the mainstream feminist movement, that this would sort of play into these stereotypes. Like, these are black marks on the history of feminism that have not been made up for. So I do think that, but not to say that I'm not optimistic. I do think that the feminist movement is getting better at recognizing at least the history of these mistakes, which is not to say that we don't keep making them, but at least we're sort of like, we're better at recognizing when they happen. And my hope is that we're better at correcting them more quickly. And so I think that there is this sort of move that now that we have in feminist and other progressive circles where we understand that we have to check our privilege. And that's a bit of a cliched term, but it's important, right? This is recognition that whenever you claim to be speaking for women as a group, you need to be damn careful you're not just speaking for women like you, right? And I think where the rubber really hits the road with that one these days is often when it comes to the inclusion of trans women in the feminist movement. That's really one of the more controversial elements these days. And it's something that I spend at least a couple of central chapters of Think Like a Feminist talking about the importance of including trans women in the feminist movement, of explaining how if we actually understand the way that feminist theory itself has evolved, it's confused to think that trans women are not feminists, right? I think that this is an important fight to be fighting, and we can talk maybe a little bit more about why I'm so vociferously opposed to TERFs and willing to really lay down and fight. And these battles get ugly, I have to say, but we can talk more about that later.
Yeah, and I completely agree, for the record. Thanks.
Yeah, I know you do.
Great. Yeah, so I really liked your answers and your emphasizing, Kate, I especially liked your summary of the tropes of Black women. I think that's so important to recognize when I teach that to I have a fairly healthy contingent of Black women in my classes, and they're always like, yes, so we're being limited in so many ways. And so I think these things are so important for us to recognize. So one of the things that as I see it, I think we've got about 10 minutes left, but I want to ask you, and Carol, you've hinted about this, that some of the questions about TERFs and things like that are some of the more controversial arguments that you're taking on in your book. And I guess I want to ask you, like, what do you feel like is the most controversial argument, or maybe there's just the thing that you're most excited about in your book that you think is like the coolest point that you make in your book, maybe? What is something that you consider to be the, sort of one of the things you're proudest of in your book? And let's see, who will go first? Kate, you go. Carol, I'm sorry, Carol, you go first on that one.
Okay. All right, I'll go. Yeah, and this is just going to be me talking more about trans issues, because that really is very, very central to one of my goals in this book. I have a dog in this fight because my partner is trans, but it's funny, I actually wrote those chapters before I met him. So, but yeah, it's been interesting to sort of see the uptake of these arguments as I published. I published an op-ed in the Times last spring where I sort of trotted out some of these arguments early, and the feedback was just shockingly vociferous, right? I'm used to writing about feminist issues in the public and having, like conservatives and regressives, like attacking me, and I'm used to that. Like, that doesn't bother me, right? When a misogynist starts attacking me, I think, okay, good, this person hates me, I'm doing my job, right? But when a self-identified feminist hates me because I'm defending the obvious claim that trans women are women, that's really, really, really disturbing. And I have to say that the caliber of the attacks has been just really, really shocking. And it's a bit depressing, right? Because I think in some ways it's like, I think progressives are very good at sort of fighting amongst ourselves as opposed to having a united front against, actual, like, the enemy, like progressives or conservatives. But and I do worry that the turf wars are the latest instance of this. But that said, this is just something that I think is really, really important, that feminists cannot afford to get this one wrong. I think that, again, if you actually understand the history or the theory, it's clear that trans women are obviously women. If you understand the feminist evolution from thinking about gender as a social construction to also understanding that sex is a social construction in various ways, and that just as gender is probably not best thought of as a strict binary where there's just only masculine and feminine roles, sex too is not really usefully thought of or accurately thought of as a binary, right? Like the human biological reality is just vastly more complex than the idea that there are only males and females, right? And so once you sort of get up to speed with this theory, which I spend several chapters of Think Like a Feminist talking about, it becomes clear that trans women are women, right? That they understand that gender is a performance. And also, and so this is important not just as a matter of inclusion, but I think it's important as a matter of us as feminists having our ideas progress, right? Learning more, right? And so just as I think that white feminists continue to have a lot to learn by listening to women of color and feminists of color, I also think that cis feminists have a lot to learn by listening to trans women, because their understanding of femininity is one that can help us as people who theorize about gender and about the experience of gender and about the social implications of gender. They have things to teach us if we actually listen. So this is, of course, obviously a matter of inclusion, but it's also just a matter of learning. And so I think it's really important, and I could go on at length, but I will not, because I have to keep talking as well. But yeah, I think I would say that my discussion of trans issues is one of the things that I find most important in this book.
Great. All right, what about you?
Thanks. I loved that aspect of Carol's book, and I think I can offer a complimentary point, because I completely agree with everything Carol said about the importance of these issues, both for moral reasons and intellectual ones. And I mean, where I come down is I find it extraordinary as someone who thinks about the nature of misogyny for a living, basically at this point. I find it amazing that anyone who calls themselves a feminist would be in the business of policing people's bodies, especially along gendered lines. That's just, to me, the ultimate irony. And the fact that there are people who are fucking with gender and who are, doing just both authentic living and who are courageous enough to be who they are in a world that is so transphobic strikes me as, something which all feminists have an absolute moral obligation to support, to celebrate, and to do everything we can to make our movement one that is genuinely trans inclusive. And in that connection, I've kind of been excited by work by a brilliant trans philosopher, Talia May Betcher, who
This book is amazing.
Yeah, she's just an amazing philosopher, has taught me so much about, well, so many issues, but one of them that really helped me in writing this book was about the sense of entitlement that we have, especially, as, here I'm speaking as a cis woman, but within a cis-sexist society, there's a sense of entitlement to have people's genitals match, quote unquote, match their gendered self-presentation. And so there is this insidious, pernicious sense that you should be able to read someone's genitals off their gender presentation that Talia May Betcher draws our attention to as sort of deep in the heart of trans misogynistic logic. And by drawing on that work, I was able to draw a parallel that I find really interesting, and I think it's important, between the anti-abortion movement, the way it polices cis as well as some trans male bodies, and the anti-trans policing of bathroom access. There's a similar construction of a notional victim who's, as far as I'm concerned, pretty notional, either the fetus on the one hand, or the supposed cis woman being preyed upon in a bathroom, which, by the way, just never happens. Study after study has shown cis men prey on people all the time, not under the cover of restroom access. Trans women are not doing the thing that transphobes worry that they might do, via this construction of a notional victim. And also this kind of sense that because of the notional victim, the bodies involved need to be policed by the anti-abortion police on the one hand, or the anti-trans police on the other. So that's something I was excited about in the book, because instead of a kind of narrow focus on just cis women's bodies, I wanted to show there was a broader logic of policing bodies and insisting they have certain genitals, certain reproductive features, and carry those, any fetuses that may enter the building to term. All of that policing is intertwined. The sense that bodies have to be one thing, have one reproductive function, and perform that reproductive function is something that I think can be helpfully analyzed as a whole, rather than as a problem that affects cis women exclusively, which misses, of course, trans male as well as some non-binary persons' pregnancies, and it also misses a potential possibility for solidarity between cis and trans women who are both having their bodies policed in ways that are fundamentally oppressive, fundamentally unjust, and that we all need as feminists to work to end.
Great, great. We have so many good questions here. We're a little bit for an hour, but let me just read the questions to you, and I'll tell you what I kind of want you to end with, which is sort of thinking about how to move forward. But let me just read the questions to you, and then that will give us some idea of just what you can address and maybe your final thoughts for the evening. So one comment that we had was a man, a cis hetero man who has been working during Me Too, and his women friends encouraged him to push his male friends on their assumptions and their behavior, which he is doing. And so he's trying to help men become more aware of their behavior, and they seem to at least be more aware when they're around him. So, there's a question of what work men can do to help social norms. There's another question about how best to move forward. This was kind of my closing question about what's the path forward for feminism. The question that they also mention is in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement, women's rights in the Supreme Court. I had a question about Amy Coney Barrett and whether she's truly a feminist or not a feminist. what we can do in the wake of the presidential election coming up. I have another good question, and I know the answer to this, but I'm going to let them address this. But have they received professional pushback at times as they've been working as feminists, and what was they like? You don't necessarily have to give specific private examples, but just, your general thoughts on being a feminist. Let's see. And then I have a comment that is everyone is thrilled to read their books, and everyone needs to read them. The comment is that everyone needs to read them. And I have one person who wants to hear Kate read her excerpt because she hasn't read hers yet. So I realize we're a little over time, but I just wanted to sort of give you a whole barrage of things to talk about in sort of your final conclusion of what you're thinking about, how we can move forward as feminists.
Yeah, that's great. I won't be able to address all of that, but I want to say something which I think addresses a couple of those points, and also was one of the things that I almost said I was excited about in this book, which is that I think we need more calls for men to be caregivers, not just to their biological children, but to be caring, as it sounded like that question asker is showing care towards specific women, and also women generally, by talking to male friends. I think that's a great start. I also think that one of the things that I've tried to show in this book is just how much things are skewed towards providing men with things like care, and as well as sex and kind of reproductive access via women, and how little we've been focused on seemingly obvious possibilities for men's lives, like being a caregiver, showing care towards female partners, showing care towards friends, including male friends, as well as being a good dad, which is something that does get emphasis. I'd love to see more of that, as well as men taking on more paid caregiving labor. So one of the reasons I find that an exciting thought would be that there's obviously a shortage of meaningful and well-paying roles for men in contemporary society. There's obviously shortages of work and crises of meaning, and yet we rarely call on men to do caregiving work that needs doing. And so part of what I want to see happen is a transformation in men's lives, not just women's.
That's great. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate.
Kate, I want to ask you to read an excerpt of your book as well, because I don't want to have done it and not have you do yours.
That's right. Oh, wait, you're muted, Kate.
Oh.
There we go. Wait, you're muted again.
Oh, you're muted.
Let me see if I can fix her.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, Carol, why don't you give your answer? I actually have an excerpt that might be good to close with. It's sort of the chapter of my book that's a letter to my daughter. So while I suck on my cough drop because I have not COVID, but seasonal allergies, do you want to jump in, and then I can read a short excerpt about what I hope my daughter kind of comes to learn about the world?
Absolutely. Okay, so then I'll use this as my chance for kind of closing remarks. Also drinking lemon tea here because it's season. So I think what my hope is for both the audience of this book and for just directions that we're heading. I think that as scary and ugly and really just out of this world has been in this last year, I think I'm actually in some ways more optimistic than I ever have been. I think that we are seeing real change in possibility for how people can live their lives. I like to say that, I think that the kids are all right. I am thrilled with the prospect of the opportunities that my daughter will have that I never had, and certainly that my mother or grandmother never had. And of course, I know that I'm speaking as a privileged white woman, but but I think that that we're seeing just new opportunities for gender expression. I think that kids who are born genderqueer or non-binary or trans have opportunities for self-expression that like even 5 or 10 years ago they wouldn't have, right? And so I think that we are in this position of really, really sort of quick social change. I think, I don't know if it feels to the rest of you, but it feels a bit like we're standing on a precipice and none of us really quite knows what's going to happen after the election next week. But I can often bring myself to be optimistic about where we're heading. I think that feminism has been around for a really long time, and I think that when it works in concert with other liberatory movements, anti-racist movements, anti-capitalist movements, we see opportunities for real social change, and I think we're actually in one of those moments. I think we saw it this summer with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think that we're seeing just like the world shifting in ways that it's unsteady and it's unstable, but it leaves me room for hope. And I think that's what I'd like to end with, is just the thought that one of the things I really wanted to do and Think Like Feminist was give people the tools that they might need to really sort of think through problems that feminists have been thinking about for hundreds of years, and really sort of take those out of the world and really shake shit up.
That's great. Thank you, Carol. All right, Kate. So if you want to read your excerpt from the letter to your daughter, it sounds like.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks so much to both of you. So this is from the final chapter of my book, and yeah, it's really about, well, you'll see, it's sort of self-explanatory. I finished my first book, Down Girl, in a spirit of despair. I give up, I wrote. I wish I could offer a more hopeful message. Instead, I concluded by offering a post-mortem, a grim overview of the reasons I was pessimistic about getting people to take the problem of misogyny seriously, or even to face it as a problem whatsoever. Although I am still far from hopeful, I am not so despairing anymore. In part, that's because I think I made an intellectual mistake the first time around. I confused the intransigence of some people with the unwillingness of most people to think soberly and deeply about the problems facing girls and women. In the interim, I've been pleasantly surprised, shocked even, to hear from many readers who have been prepared, even eager, to think through these problems with me with the aim of combating them. There is still an enormous amount of energy that goes into denying and minimizing misogyny, of course, as this book has sadly made all too clear. But there is also a lot of momentum, extant and building, in the efforts to resist it. Another reason I'm no longer as despairing is more personal. I wrote much of this book while pregnant with my first child, and I came to feel that my previous despair had been something of a luxury I can now ill afford to indulge in. I am still pessimistic about the possibility of making much needed feminist social progress without incurring destructive, toxic backlash. But giving up no longer feels like a viable option. I increasingly feel the need to keep fighting, regardless of the outcome. Hope to me is a belief that the future will be brighter, which I continue not to set much store in. But the idea of fighting for a better world, and equally importantly, fighting against backsliding, is not a belief. It's a political commitment that I can get on board with. These sentiments were further fueled when my husband and I were told we were having a girl. We were delighted and terrified. It is difficult to reconcile the desires we naturally have for our child with a sober acknowledgement of the realities of misogyny and the male entitlement that often gives rise to it. As we've seen throughout this book, girls and women are all too frequently punished for not giving a man what he is tacitly deemed entitled to, and not just because of his own overblown sense of what he deserves, but by dint of the social structures that work to enable, foster, and sustain male privilege. Clearly, as parents, we want better for our daughter. So what do I want my daughter to know when it comes to what she is entitled to? I want my daughter to know that she is entitled to feel pain, be it physical or emotional pain, and that she is subsequently entitled to cry out or ask for help, and to be cared for, soothed, nurtured. I want her to know that she's entitled to be believed about her physical and emotional needs, and that she is as worthy of care, medical and otherwise, as is any other person. I want her to know that she's entitled to bodily autonomy, to choose whether, when, and how she is touched by anyone who expresses a desire to do so. And yes, they must ask for rather than just assuming her consent. I want her to know that hugs and kisses, however well-meaning, are always optional. I want her to feel no guilt or shame in saying no to anyone's potential encroachment upon her body. When the time comes, I want her to know that she's entitled to full control over her reproductive capacities, and that the decision about whether or not to bear children is her own and no one else's. I want her to know that her presumed gender is just that, a presumption on our part, which she is entirely entitled to tell us we've been wrong about. I want our child to know that being a boy or being non-binary are not only viable options, but will be positively embraced and supported within our household, and that we will fight at every turn to make the world a place in which all trans and non-binary children and adults can flourish. I want my daughter to know that women, as much as men, along with non-binary people, are entitled to support from others in fulfilling adult responsibilities. I'm relieved that she will grow up in a household where she's just as likely, if not likelier, to see her father as her mother making meals, doing dishes, and putting in a load of laundry. I want my daughter to know that she's entitled to use and enjoy her body in a huge variety of ways, to play sports, to play music, to dance, to stim, to express joy or grief or fear or sheer silliness. I want her to know that she's entitled to eat heartily, to take up space, to be loud, and to enjoy the kind of lack of bodily self-consciousness that I can only dream of. Even during my pregnancy, I can anticipate being willing to cheerfully kill anyone who makes her feel ashamed of her body, whatever its shape, size, disabilities, typicality, and so on. To be clear, I am perfectly well aware I am not entitled to do this. I want my daughter to know that human sexuality comes in so many different forms, that she is entitled to be straight, queer, bisexual, asexual, and so on. As she grows older, she's now 11 months, I want her to know that she is entitled to thoroughly enjoy her sexuality, whatever that turns out to be, without the slightest shame or stigma. I want her to know that she's entitled to say no to sex without the slightest shame or stigma either. I also want her to know, and this is hard to write, that any abuse, harassment, or assault she may face, sexual or otherwise, is a moral abomination. I've not yet figured out how or how much to tell her about the realities of male sexual entitlement and violence that have so occupied my consciousness over the past several years, including while pregnant with her in writing the book you've been reading. Here, words fail me.
That was very powerful, Kate. Thank you for sharing that with us. That was a wonderful letter. And on that note, I think we have a wonderful vision for what we can imagine our future generations, that their lives will be like, that we can always work for and hope for. And I just want to give a round of applause. I think I'm the only one who will be able to see giving the round of applause. Kate and Carol tonight for sharing and for making themselves available to us to share with us and so that we can learn from them and look forward to reading their books. So if you haven't read them yet, please be sure to pick up these two wonderful books. We're so grateful to Chaucer's bookstore for hosting this event tonight, for being such a wonderful partner and sharing in feminism. So I'm going to turn things back over to you, Michael, and thank you so much for having us tonight.
Just briefly, Carol, Kate, thank you very much. It was a wonderful evening. And Julinna, you're an amazing moderator. Everyone, please purchase their books. Be safe out there, and don't forget to vote. Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye. Thank you.